Have you ever heard of a company that, instead of just buying from the best suppliers, decided to build them from the ground up? Well, that's exactly what Honda of America did back in the 80s and 90s. They literally went into other companies' factories and helped transform them, creating one of the best supply chains on the planet. It really makes you scratch your head, right? I mean, why would a company invest so much of its own time and money to fix someone else's problems? Most would just find a new supplier and call it a day. So, what was Honda thinking? That's the big question we're going to tackle today. So, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the puzzle Honda was trying to solve. Then, we'll get into their unique BP philosophy. We'll see it in action with three totally different suppliers, pull out the big lessons for everyone, and finally, talk about the secret ingredient that made it all work: trust. Okay, so to really get why Honda's approach was such a game changer, you have to look at the other roads they could have taken, but didn't. You know, when a company wants better parts, there are usually three standard moves. First, you could just make the parts yourself. That's vertical integration. But man, that is expensive, and you can get bogged down doing stuff that isn't your core business. Second option, just drop your current supplier and switch to a better one. The problem there is you lose all the history and trust you've built. And let's be real, the best suppliers are probably already busy. Or number three, you could just tell your supplier, hey, go hire a consultant. But the kind of deep, on-the-ground knowledge Honda wanted to share, well, you can't learn that from a PowerPoint. It has to be taught person to person on the factory floor. So Honda decided they were the best ones for the job. Since none of those options felt right, Honda basically created its own path. And it all came down to this really unique, hands-on program driven by a core philosophy. First off, we need to be clear on the goal. Honda wanted to teach its suppliers something called lean production. Now, this isn't just about cutting costs. It's a whole system, a way of thinking, built on wiping out waste, empowering the people actually doing the work, and creating a culture where you're always getting better. They call that Kaizen. And the tool they used to teach this, it was called BP. It stands for Best Practice, Best Process, and Best Performance. And listen, this was not some boring seminar or thick manual. Honda would literally send its own people, engineers, production veterans, to go live at a supplier's factory for weeks, sometimes months, working shoulder to shoulder with them to change things from the inside out. And the BP goals show you just how practical this was. It was all about breaking old habits. Instead of going with gut feelings, they had to collect real data. Instead of big, expensive machines, they were taught to find simple, common-sense fixes by asking why over and over again. And you couldn't solve a problem from your office chair. You had to go see the actual part in the actual place in the actual situation. Every single one of these things was designed to do one thing: create a super smooth, waste-free production line. And you have to understand, for the Honda folks running this program, this went way beyond a business tactic. As one of their engineers, Rick Mayo, put it, they saw it as a mission, not a job. It was about spreading a philosophy of partnership and excellence that was so much bigger than just tweaking a process. All right, a philosophy sounds great on paper, but how does it actually hold up in the messy real world with real companies and real problems? Well, let's look at three case studies that really put the BP program through its paces. So let's meet our players. We've got Capital Plastics, a company that relied heavily on Honda's business. Then there's Tower Automotive, a bigger, more established player. And finally, Progressive Industries, a smaller, family-owned shop. Three very different partners, three very different stories. Our first story is about Capital Plastics. Now, these guys were one of Honda's earliest suppliers in the US, and they were super eager to do a good job. But they were constantly struggling with quality and delivery as Honda's business just kept getting bigger and more demanding. The owner of Capital described it perfectly. He said keeping up with Honda was like trying to keep hold of a tiger. It just captures that feeling of being overwhelmed. So to help them out, Honda sent in a BP team that lived at their factory for 9 months. And the results, right off the bat, were incredible. On just one production line, they boosted productivity by 45% and cut down on waste by 67%. So yeah, the method worked. But the real question was, would it stick? Okay, our second case, Tower Automotive, was a totally different animal. These guys were pros. They were a longtime supplier to the big three automakers, especially Ford. They knew what they were doing and were used to a completely different kind of customer. And this is where you really see a culture clash. Honda was obsessed with how the actual part fit the actual car. They were always on the shop floor, giving super detailed feedback every single day. Ford, on the other hand, was all about the blueprints.
They managed from a distance with systems and procedures. For Tower, trying to live in both of these worlds was a massive headache. One manager liked Ford's hands-off style, but another had to admit that Honda, while frustrating, was almost always right. And that brings us to our final story, Progressive Industries. They were a small, family-run stamping company. But the thing that made them different was their leadership. The founder's son was running the show, and he was incredibly open-minded and just immediately clicked with the Honda philosophy. And this is where that Kaizen spirit really came alive. We're not talking about some multi-million-dollar overhaul here. Just look at the little changes they made to a single machine, moving a control panel so it's easier to reach, welding on some tool holders, piping in oil instead of carrying it. Each one is a tiny, common-sense tweak that, when you add them all up, had a massive effect on efficiency. That right there is BP in a nutshell. So after all that, what was the final score? Well, for Capital Plastics, the struggling student, the changes didn't last. Once the Honda team left, things went back to the old ways. For Tower, the capable but conflicted partner, it was kind of a mixed bag, but they were so good at what they did, they actually ended up teaching Honda a thing or two. And for Progressive, the eager protege, the philosophy stuck. Not only did they keep getting better, they grew into a true, innovative partner for Honda. Okay, so what can we all take away from these stories? Because there are some really powerful lessons here for any business, whether you're the customer trying to help a partner or the supplier trying to learn and grow. For customers, the Hondas of the world, the takeaways are crystal clear. 1, you have to break down the learning into small, manageable projects. 2, you've got to pick partners who have what's called absorptive capacity. Basically, they have the skills and the desire to actually learn, like Progressive did. And hey, the goal has to be making them self-sufficient, not dependent on you forever. And finally, you have to walk this tightrope of teaching and monitoring, all while building a solid foundation of trust. And for the suppliers, the lessons are just as vital. First, you have to recognize the value in what you're being taught. You also have to be sure your customer is trustworthy, that they won't use what they learn about you against you later. It's also on you to get your own employees excited and involved. That's where Capital failed and Progressive succeeded. And maybe the biggest lesson of all, you have to grow your skills just as fast as you grow your sales. Otherwise, you'll find yourself trying to hold on to a tiger. This brings us to the very last piece of the puzzle. And honestly, it's the most important one. It's the thing you can't just write into a contract. At the end of the day, Honda's whole strategy worked because of something called goodwill trust. The suppliers had to believe deep down that Honda had their back, even without a contract guaranteeing future business. And Honda had to trust its suppliers with its most precious asset, its philosophy. So it leaves us with a really powerful question to think about. In a business world that is obsessed with ironclad contracts and legal protections, could it be that the single biggest competitive advantage is actually an unwritten promise, one that's built on nothing more than mutual respect and a shared desire to win together? It's a pretty radical idea.